So in this video, we're going to look at database support. Now, we've not looked at this tool window before, but we've got over here a database window. And again, if it's not there, if you do this ... it'll be in this list. When you first click on it, there'll be nothing here, but you can click on plus to connect to a database. When we go to use connection string, we can use this drop down as a reference to see what database it supports. So we can see it supports SQL Server, MySQL, Postgres, SQLite, Redis, and a lot of other ones as well. In this video though, we're going to look at SQL Server. And to do this, let's just close this window. I've got a Docker file, and you can find this in the GitHub repository associated with this course. Let's just collapse some of these windows. Now, going into Docker files is out of scope of this course. I do have another Dome Train course which deep dives heavily into Docker, but I'm just going to use this to spin up a database with some seed data. So I'm using the Microsoft AdventureWorks example database, and this was downloaded from Microsoft. I will include a link in the README in the same folder showing where this was downloaded from, but I have actually included this back file as part of this GitHub repository because it was only 8 meg. So if you download this, you'll have it anyway. So basically this spins up SQL Server, and then it applies this back file so that we've got a database with data in it so that we can explore it using the tooling. If you're following along, you can either use this, or if you've got your own database you can connect to, then use that. Obviously, this does require that you've got Docker installed. Going back to the Explorer tool window, I've included like a PowerShell script and a Bash script, which just builds and runs it. An alternative, and we'll talk more about using containers and Docker in Rider in an upcoming video, but just as a sneak preview, if I go to Dockerfile, I can right click and say run Dockerfile. This will then build it at the bottom, and it's going to run it and give it a random name. So if I lift this up a bit, again, I'll talk more about this in an upcoming video. If I go to dashboard, I'm just going to assign a port 1433, which is the SQL Server port. And let's say host port as well, also 1433. We create the container. So now we've got this port forwarding. So all I've done there is I've used Docker to spin up a container of SQL Server that already has the AdventureWorks database in. So now we can look at the database tooling. And as I say, if you've got your own database and you don't have Docker, then feel free to follow along with that instead. So if I go to this database view we saw before and click plus and connect to database, I can use a connection string here, or I can just say next. I'm going to choose that data source. I'm going to use localhost. That port is the default, so let's leave that blank, and then next again. In this script, now obviously I don't normally put passwords in code, but this is a demo. If I copy this password here and paste this in and use SA as the user, and then I can test the connection, and it's succeeded, so let's say connect to database. So now we can see up here we've got localhost. If I expand it, we can see master, but we can't see our AdventureWorks database. So what we can do is, if you click on this 1 of 5, we can then select what we want to see. So if I do AdventureWorks and then click away, then we've got this here. If I expand this, there's not much information here, but again, we've got 0 or 14. If I click on this, then we want DBO, which is the default one. We also want sales LT, which is one this AdventureWorks database has. So these are the schemas. If I click away, then that's now appearing. If I expand this, I can view the tables. I can expand the tables to see what you'd normally expect from things like SQL Server Management Studio or whatever client you use. It's like columns and keys and things. I can also double click on a table. And that opens up a window with kind of a grid view of all the data. If I just collapse this and this. So there's a few really nice things we can do here. We can actually double click and edit in line, edit the cells. Along the top, there's these filters. So I could do here and say, let's say color. And we've got the IntelliSense equals blue. And that's now filtered by blue. We can do the same with the order by and get IntelliSense as well. Looking at these menu items, we've got refresh, so we can reload the page. We can tell it to automatically refresh every given time period. We can add rows, we can remove rows. We can go to the DDL so you can see the actual SQL that created this table. We can toggle a local filter. So if we see on the columns, if we do this now, that hides this. So if I go to one of these, I can then filter here. Color is a better example if we do that. In fact, let's get rid of this filter here and then just go to color. I can see the counts and then I can click and drill down, which is very powerful. Also, we can automatically generate charts. So if I click on this one, we've got a nice chart. Clicking on this settings cog, then I can choose what column each axis represents, and I can choose different types. It does automatically try and pick the best chart type for the data. So if I go on something else, like a dress, and then click on the chart, see that's slightly different. If I do this and click on chart, so it'll try and work out what the best chart is to use for that data. There's also, if we go back to product, let's get rid of the chart. And if I click on this next one, record view, this is quite nice because we get, for the record that's selected, we get kind of a form view of that record. So it's transposed it, and it's just a bit of a better view for editing. You've also got aggregates at the top, which if we multi-select some rows, then we've got like the sum and all this kind of thing, which in our case, because I've selected product IDs, that's not that useful, but you get the idea. The fact you can select a bunch of cells and then it will see the sum straight away is quite useful. As well as this view, if you go back to the database tool window and you click plus, then you've got query window as well. So we can click this and we can actually have an editor where we can type in a query. And because it's connected to this database, we get the IntelliSense. So if I do select star from product, where color equals black, let's just go with that. I can Control A to select all and then do this to execute, or I could just press Control and Enter. So let's do that. And we can see down here in this services window again, which we've seen has containers. We're going to talk about more about the Docker stuff and Kubernetes in an upcoming video in this module. But you can see here we've got databases as well. And each of these entries basically references these tabs I've got open. If I close some, we've got sales order detail, which we can see here. If I close this tab, that then goes away from here because it's closed that session. And we can see over here, it's the same view we saw earlier. So we've got the same filters, we've got the same buttons and options. It's just within the services pane. Another thing you can do, if I collapse that down a bit, I can right click on a database and go to diagrams and say show diagram. And this uses the same kind of diagramming technology that we saw earlier on this course when we're talking about dependencies, this Y files, and the same shortcuts. So I can zoom in with Control mouse wheel. I can drag with the right mouse button, and I can view a diagram of my database schema. And the last thing I want to show in this video is if you look at the GitHub repository associated with this course in the database and SQL support in this module directory and console app database query, and we open up this console application, I've created a very simple ADO query. So it connects to localhost, again, the same database, the same username and password. And again, I wouldn't normally put a secret in Git, but this is just a demo. And I've got a query saying select star from product, and then it just loops through and prints out the product name. And what I want to show is if I go to this query, so you can see in the string, so this is a raw string, we've got syntax highlighting. And I'll talk more about this in an upcoming video in this module where I talk about language injections. So we'll talk more about how this is working. But what I want to show is if I, anywhere on the file, actually not just there, if I right click and say attach data source, then it allows us to link this file to a data source. And we can see I've got this drop down so I can remove it here. I can choose which database. But now I can do things like if I do dot product, we've got the auto completion. I can Alt Enter and say run the query in the console. So that's going to pop that up, and we've already seen this view. I can even do things like F12 into, and it's taken me to that DDL. If I close this. So this whole concept of language injections is actually really powerful, and it applies to much more than just SQL, but I will cover that more in depth in a later video in this module. But I think that gives you enough of an overview of the database functionality. There's other things like we can copy to a database, we can export data. If we do that, we can choose how to extract it, whether it's CSV, Excel, various things. It's just a really powerful way to interact with your databases. And just like the other things we've spoken about, like with Git integration, with the HTTP client. Just being able to stay in the Rider IDE while you do all these different things is just really powerful and really helps with your productivity. So I've mentioned a few times in this course about scratches, saying that I would cover this later on in the course. Well, this is the video I'm going to do that. And I must admit, this is something I don't quite like about Rider. In a lot of editors and IDEs, you can do like Control-N and start a new file. There is no new file here. I quite often just want to create an empty file that's not saved anywhere or anything, which is kind of what Scratches does, I guess. Basically what you can do Control-Shift-Alt and Insert, and it will pop this up. So you can choose what type of file it is. So let's do CS for a C# file. I could have done a text file, or I could have done an HTTP file. There's various options. And then this then puts it into my Scratches section. If I hover the mouse over here so we can see the path, it's not in my project folder. It's basically shared, it's global. We can see there's a bunch of previous ones. If I open up another .NET solution, it'll be there. So basically it's a global Scratch file that you can put things in. I can right click on Scratches and say add a directory, so I can categorize them and add a hierarchy. I can, just like anywhere else, I can Control RR and give it a name. So let's just put demo. So I can see it in a way why it's more useful in some ways than doing Control-N, because sometimes if you close the IDE or editor, you might lose that information. But on the flip side, I find that this becomes a dumping ground. Because it's global, I kind of just end up with lots of these files. I've cleaned this out recently and I've got a whole bunch more. Normally I have a lot more than this because it's just easy to leave them hanging around. So I kind of suspect this is a bit like Marmite. Some people will love it, some people will hate it and want to just be able to do Control-N and have an untitled file. I would be really interested in what you think, so do let me know and I'll pass that on to the JetBrains team.